All right, I think we're gonna get going here. Welcome everyone. My name is June McCartan. I'm with a firm called Out with Studio. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. Today we're going to be discussing the New Hampshire Housing Toolbox, which is a project that I worked on with many representatives from the regional planning commissions. And today's session is about introducing you to the toolbox itself, and going through each of the tools within it to give a sort of high-level overview. Just as a maybe to start this off, actually, we'll have our other speakers introduce themselves. We have Mike Tardif and Matt Monahan.
Good afternoon, all. Mike Tardif from Central Regional Planning Commission. And Matt?
I'm Matt, also from Central.
Thanks, guys. So a bit on logistics today. We're going to have a presentation. We'll try to keep it as brief as possible, and then we'll go into a Q&A. During the question and answer session, if you can raise your hand via Teams, that way we can call on you, make sure you have the ability to speak and ask your question. And then in addition to that, during the whole presentation and even during the Q&A, you can post questions in the chat. So to do these things, there's a little bar at the bottom of Teams. There is a chat icon, which looks like a talking bubble, a raising hand icon, which just looks like a hand. You can add reactions through this smiley face icons that'll sort of give you a temporary reaction on the screen. You can change your screen view, etc. This is a webinar format for Teams, so in general, you won't be able to just turn on your camera or mic to speak. We'll have to, if you do want to be part of the Q&A, you'll just have to raise your hand and we can make sure that happens. Great. So just a little bit about the toolbox. It's a collection of 20 planning and zoning strategies for housing production in New Hampshire communities. So I'll break that down a little bit, but it's essentially tools that are aimed at the local level that local governments can work to implement. There's a lot of issues when we talk about housing, but we're really focused on housing production within this toolbox. It touches on a lot of other things, different housing subjects, conservation, infrastructure, but at the core of it, the purpose behind each one and why we bring it to the toolbox is for that housing production role it plays. The toolbox lives in two formats. There's a PDF download and an interactive website. Both those are available at nhhousingtoolbox.org. And that was live officially as of this morning. So very exciting. And there's sort of a screenshot of the website there. Some background on where this came from. It's part of this statewide coordinated regional housing needs assessment process where all of the RPCs are undertaking an RHNA process. That whole effort and really the toolbox specifically was funded by ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act. So money that's from the federal government that was earmarked for a number of purposes, some of which relates to housing. The toolbox was put together by a subcommittee of staff from RPCs from around the state and some staff from New Hampshire Housing, and facilitated by the Office of Planning and Development at the state level. Two consultant firms, my own Out with Studio and Boku, were aided in this process. Out with handled sort of the content and visual identity stuff, and then Boku was our web developer. So what are we trying to do here? We're trying to answer these questions about each tool. What is it? How can it help your community? How has it been used elsewhere? what does implementation look like at the local level, and where can you learn more? So this is meant to be briefings on each of these tools, and ultimately a guidepost on what to do next, and where you can get more in depth. The audience, again, I said it was, this is really about local government and local implementation. So it's really anyone working in and around local government. That could be planning staff or other staff, planning board members, select board members, legislative body members, or even local advocates, people who are sort of active citizens in their community but don't necessarily hold a formal role. This can aid folks in whatever way they serve. And again, the idea is to really just save time on upfront research and give people a path forward. Each tool, we just go through a repeated structure. This isn't how we're going to format the overview today, but just so you know, we answer those questions. What is it? How can it help? Getting started, which is your implementation, map, and then considerations, which is like, all right, here are pieces of like nuance or important things you might have to think about as you transform this from a general policy into a local policy. A list of resources from outside this toolbox. A list of issues addressed. So we've broken this down by a series of issues related to housing production. So you can sort of target your efforts to the things that are most important to your community. Related tools, which are other tools in the toolbox that might work together, or they might be sort of alternatives to one another. State laws, so where there's enabling legislation or important, other laws and rules, we note those, and then case studies from New Hampshire and beyond. I mentioned there's broken down by issues addressed. We broke these down into housing options, housing costs, affordable housing. So that's sort of like formal, deed restricted, affordable housing, workforce housing, sustainable housing, multi-generational housing options, questions around infrastructure. So lack of capacity, either, helping you to build up capacity or sort of work around limitations, and then redevelopment of, say, underutilized or vacant properties. All right, so that's the broadest possible overview. You can go to the website and find out more. Now we're going to go into each tool, and we're just going to give notes about that. We're going to be ping-ponging between me, Matt, and Mike. So we'll try to make that as graceful as possible. And I'll do some emceeing. And I'll just note, this is our first of 5 sessions. We are going to be talking about other tools in the remainder of the 4, and we'll be really drilling down into 1 or 2 tools per session. So when a title is in orange, it means we're having a full session about it, and I'll just call those out as they come up. Just another bit of framing. This isn't a way we've organized the tools in the toolbox because it's a little over-determined, but for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to break these down into sort of broad approaches to development, specific like zoning tools, tools around financing, and then just other miscellaneous. So you'll see this card here. We're talking about broad development approaches first. So kicking us off is Matt with infill development.
Yeah, so this tool, I think the picture really captures it, right? So essentially what this is if you think about a village, right? Your village in your community, or if you have multiple villages, it's a way to get more new development in a compact area. So it looks at new construction. Here's a benefit. It takes advantage of existing infrastructure. So sewer, water, electricity, and roads, right? A lot of the costs associated with development in green spaces out in the hinterlands is infrastructure cost, new roads, new pipes, things of that nature. So this is a benefit of that. It probably will result in or require zoning changes, increased density. I mean, if you look at these two the graphic here, I think it really captures it, because you've got on that top graphic, you can kind of see the yellow building and then the space next to it on either side of the street there. And then the bottom one, you know, presumably in this case, you could say that there's a increased density, right? So reducing that lot size and those frontages to basically get more construction, more new buildings in that area. And you may have to, I know a lot of people may look at it and say, well, you know, in our town, we've already got some kind of small lots in the village, and it may require a developer to say, okay, I want to do a little larger building, maybe 3 stories, to get commercial first floor, and then, you know, some housing on the second and third floor. And in that case, they may need to put some properties together, do the lot merger form, then come before the planning board with their site plan after that. But essentially what this is, it's just what it says. It's infill, looking at those more dense areas and just increasing the density overall to get more development.
Awesome. So we're gonna run through these, jump forward, and then, you know, either write your questions in the chat or hold them to the Q&A portion. Mixed use development. Mike, this is on you here.
Yep. Thanks, June. So a lot of these concepts all start with the master plan discussion, and what we have seen over the last, 5 years, 8 years in our land use conversations, economic development, that conversation about mixed use comes up. And whether it's in a village area or in an area around an exit, perhaps exit 17 comes to mind, Concord, Canterbury, where perhaps some of the zoning, the underlying zoning doesn't allow for those mixed uses, but it's one of those things that a community is looking for and looking to promote. So starting with a master plan, thinking about those, what the form and uses that community is interested in, realizing that these things are hard, and zoning changes are one path, but also understanding that small retail uses are hard to encourage, and being able to reach out to having a potential retail use in mind when you're thinking about these types of changes in your zoning is all part of the package. So it's a zoning process, but perhaps an economic development committee process as well. And I would say that and we'll talk about a lot of these uses. The key is a lot of public engagement and a public process that builds towards a town meeting, and these things take a while.
Great. So up next is adaptive reuse. So this is adaptation of existing non-residential buildings for housing. In a lot of communities, this might be a mill building, or another sort of like older industrial or institutional structure. You see some like older 19th century hospitals, or sometimes the rectory of a church. These are buildings that can be well suited in certain cases to residential uses. Now these are complex projects. To make an older building meet contemporary building standards for residential can be quite difficult. And then there's the question on sort of the mill industrial side of environmental remediation and brownfields. So very complex projects can involve a lot of upfront costs. We note that state DES and US EPA both have grants and loans available around brownfield. So if that's a specific issue, you can sort of look to that for assessments or even the cleanup. Larger projects certainly benefit from mixed use potential, where the retail uses could act as a catalyst of interest in the site or make it seem more like a community, and vice versa. The residents can serve as a customer base. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but RSA 79E, the Community Revitalization Tax Relief Incentive, can be a tool in a local government's toolbox to spur this investment. Okay. Next is age-friendly neighborhoods, and again, this is a broad development approach. It's the idea that a lot of conventional development, conventional subdivisions, the way housing has been done in the last decades, isn't always the right fit for either young people, young adults, or the elderly. And actually, there's a whole class of needs on both sides of the spectrum that are not met by a lot of conventional development. So, smaller, more affordable, accessible homes with universal design principles that can be, not only purchased, but maintained and used to their fullest potential by both younger and older people. Having things like community spaces or open space within a short walking distance, having multi-generational options for sort of more complex like family systems and sort of care management, things like infrastructure, sidewalks, and then single-story housing layouts. It's these pieces of housing development and community development that come up again and again, particularly in aging communities, but also communities seeking sort of younger residents, younger families, et cetera. Now, there's a sort of class of ordinances that a town can look at around age-friendly neighborhoods as a way to encourage this. They often encourage this kind of development through incentives, something that might look like inclusionary zoning, and then design requirements. And there's been a couple cases of those in New Hampshire, either targeting age-friendly communities broadly or specifically older adults. So in some ways, I'd say it's a framing device for some of the ideas that come up elsewhere, things like mixed use or things like compact development, et cetera. It's a way to put a finer point on why this is important. All right, so there's a couple broad approaches to development. Now we're going to get into some more specific tools, first on the zoning side. So I'm going to pass it to Mike for cluster housing.
So cluster is one of the first places we start when we're working with the town on a housing chapter or zoning amendments, talking about housing. And oftentimes we start with the difficulty of developing using an existing cluster ordinance and options. Well, the first thing said is, oh yeah, we have a cluster ordinance on the books. Nobody ever uses it, and why? Well, the complexity of the process, the difficulty of developing a yield plan, the just the economics tied to that. So, what are a couple of things that a town can do, community can do to make it more of a more of an option for a developer is think about the process, think about the potential for density bonuses for you've connected to a trail network, you might have an opportunity for some more for a higher density, or those different options to make it to be more proactive if you really want to have cluster or developments be located in your community. The really a key to to that is, whether it's a permitted use or, what's that, whether it's a special exception to, just the clarity of the permitting process. And there's other issues like the size of the parent lot and things like that. So I would say, in the majority of communities that we're working with right now under the Invest New Hampshire program, we're addressing cluster and mostly process, location, and really the question as to, how much do you want to promote this as a viable possibility in your community. And we'll do a much deeper dive on cluster in one of the
So a week from right now.
There we go.
We'll do a deep dive on cluster housing, and we have a planner from Salem, New Hampshire, where they've seen a lot of what's called their open space development, or open space preservation development. And what's really fascinating is they don't really get conventional subdivisions. They like only get open space preservation development. So we're going to be talking through what their ordinance is like, why that might be, and then a lot of the nuances, like, nothing's perfect. They've made tweaks over the years and sort of what they've done to make it work. So similar to cluster is a tool called the Village Plan Alternative. Now, this is an authorized innovative land use control in New Hampshire law. And under a Village Plan Alternative, essentially take a large site and instead of spreading development across that whole site, you concentrate it like you would with any cluster. But in the Village Plan Alternative, it's really focused on mixed use development, sort of compact new village development. If you're looking to create sort of a whole new village, or I think you're authorized to do an extension of an existing village potentially as well. But the idea is to do this sort of compact village style development with a mix of uses, the mix of housing types, et cetera. And 80% of the sort of total land area must be conserved. So it's this state version of cluster that's sort of has this particular motive behind it. Now, only 5 communities have adopted the Village Plan Alternative, and there aren't really, I don't think, any New Hampshire examples you can turn to. But this idea of doing mixed use new village development is, within a larger preserved open space area is not new. It's been used elsewhere in the country, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Georgia. There's a really cool example in the toolbox from Georgia. I'm encouraged more exploration of this one. I think it does a lot of good things at once, and sort of it'll take some visionary thinking, I think, to make it work in New Hampshire, but certainly opportunity there. So the next tool is transfer of development rights. This is another tool that we're going to be diving, more in depth on, and that's on June 15th, 2 weeks from today. But the idea of a transfer of development rights is that you have this development capacity in your town, like a zoned development capacity, where in theory, each lot has a certain number of homes that they could build on it if they wanted to, if there was a market for it, et cetera. Now, some of your town might be already more built out. It has infrastructure, it has existing sort of village area, it has existing neighborhoods. And there might be other parts that are more rural, lacking the infrastructure. The transfer development rights tool says, okay, for folks in that more rural area, they can sell their development rights, what they're allowed to build, as a credit, and a landowner in the more built out area can buy that credit from that landowner and then has the ability to build more on their site. So that's the transfer of allowable development, the development rights there. there's typically this officially designated sending zone, and that would be the rural area, and an officially designated receiving zone, and that would be the more built out area. I've also seen it used to take it out just out of that rural, developed context. I've seen it used as a way to do transitions from higher density development to lower density development. That's much more atypical. Now it sort of must be well calibrated to ensure its use. You need to have a way to figure out, all right, what can people actually build? If you have a super discretionary process where it's not super clear what anyone can build until the planning board decides, then that's not going to be an easily valued credit. No one will really know what a unit of housing allowance is worth. So you need to have some understanding of what the real market could be. And then there needs to be administrative capacity to pull one of these things off. It's, you're sort of managing a suite of valuations and transactions. And of course, not every community has the sort of ability to do that. So I'm excited to dive more into this because it's a complex tool. And I think we all think it has a lot of potential. There's some places that have done it around the country to some success. So yeah, we're excited to explore that more. Okay, so next is missing middle housing types. This is somewhere between a specific zoning tool and a sort of development approach. But missing middle is the idea is that we have sort of conventional development based on large single family homes on large lots that has been sort of prevalent over the past 70 years or however long. And then there's what you see in a lot of contemporary multifamily development, which is very large scale corridor buildings, double loaded corridor. You can get as much length on the project as you can to build as many of the apartments as you can, typically resulting in kind of these large, very large buildings. A missing middle typology is sort of anything in between that scale, something that would have been more allowed and more prevalent, honestly, before the advent of zoning, and certainly before World War II. These are things like duplexes, townhomes, small apartment buildings, maybe with 2 to 4 units, that sort of thing, and then even larger than 4 units, but smaller than a large apartment block. Something like what we refer to as a 6-pack, or say some sort of courtyard typology. Building types that won't work in every single community or in every single area in every town or city, but oftentimes there's a place for one or more of them in these neighborhoods, particularly in the sort of village areas where they might already exist. Often these are banned explicitly through use rules, or implicitly through dimensional rules, subdivision rules, parking requirements. So this is, when we talk about these missing middle housing types, we're really talking about adjusting zoning to allow them in as explicit and real way as possible. Yes. Related to that, perhaps in getting into more detail, is reduced zoning and subdivision requirements. So a lot of times we saw in the sort of mid to late 20th century and even persisting today is that zoning requirements began to exceed what had already been in the town and sort of the type of urban fabric that folks really love about their community. Zoning requirements started to exceed that, so either requiring more land area per unit, requiring setbacks which are out of character with the community, and have the sort of added effects of increasing costs, decreasing potential opportunities for development, or creating and incentivizing homes that were extremely large and extremely expensive. So this is really whereas you might think of missing middle housing tool is more about changing the use and being explicit in allowing uses. This is more about those dimensional parking and subdivision rules that for specifically single family homes make them larger and more expensive than they would otherwise be.
If I may, June, we're having
Yes.
more and more conversations about the reduction of the parking requirements, especially when you start to talk about, that whole infill, form-based village mixed use. And, it's the amount of land taken up by those parking requirements. And so, even over the last couple of years, much more of a conversation about reducing those standards and more openness to that conversation.
So you just raised another point here, form-based codes, and I'm going to pass this one off to Matt.
Yeah, so this one, if you think back to the infill one that we talked about earlier, this one is not that dissimilar, right? It focuses on increasing and maximizing density, and it's typically found in villages, downtowns, things like that. It can complement historic character and traditional villages. It can also simplify the zoning considerations, which can improve the ability to get projects through. And the elements of really what it's all about at the most basic level, it's about zoning that focuses on the physical aspects of things as opposed to the use, right? So if you look at this diagram here, these pictures of the building, think back to the previous slide that June showed with the reducing of setbacks and things like that on single family homes for subdivisions. It's a similar approach here. So it looks at reducing, so the stuff typically associated with that, you can have maximum setbacks instead of minimum, right? So typically you may see 25-foot setback at least in the front. Well, in form-based code, you can actually see the opposite, where it says, pull the structure forward. We only want to see a 10-foot setback, as a for instance. And spinning off what Mike was talking about parking, you can actually have conversations around maximum parking, right? Think of them all at Christmas time. The parking lot can be full, but fast forward a couple months, the parking is not really used. It's just taking up space. And it's not really helping. It's just creating impervious and things like that. So dealing with setbacks, dealing with parking. Another area that it can focus on is streetscape and walkability for pedestrians, talking about having public spaces in front of the buildings that are now closer. Architectural standards are another thing that they often address. And also mechanical HVAC, things like that, in parking to the back, to the side, out of view, so that the whole purpose of it is you're creating these public spaces that are walkable, good, the quality of life, right? Like walking down the street, it's good public spaces and just a place you want to be, right? Vibrancy. But also infill and increasing that density is a byproduct of that as well. And a lot of these tools just fold right into each other. 79E is going to be one of those as well. So that's basically form-based code, structure instead of use, and pulling things to the road, creating vibrant public spaces.
Yeah, I think of it as a inverse of the way traditional zoning works, where, all right, you say, okay, well, I have a site of this size and I can provide this many units per acre and I'm allowed to do these things. What kind of building can I build? Is instead the community saying, we want this kind of building. Here's a law that enables that. So it's.
Oh, yeah. And one last thing to add to that is, yes, it typically is not really concerned with use, but as with any of these tools, you can shape it and craft it to your community. And you may want to talk about a couple of uses that you want to encourage or discourage in those areas. So Yeah.
Great. There's a question in the chat. Where would something like a density bonus or other incentives in order to create missing middle homes or some other thing, where would that originate? Are they within a zoning ordinance? And yes, typically those would be bonuses specified in the zoning, either as, typically as a formula over, some additional percentage of units above what a site would otherwise be allowed to build. Yes.
You could also think about stacking some of those density bonuses. Maybe you have 2 or 3.
Yeah.
And it, to a certain level.
All right, planned unit developments. This is a broad class of really zoning and permitting strategies. So this is one of the innovative land use controls specified in New Hampshire law as available to towns. And it's basically a tool that's, instead of setting rules and saying as long as the landowner plays by those rules, like we'll get some outcome that we might like. It's saying, okay, let's work together with the property owner and come up with a design that's going to work. So you typically see it as a large, complex site, perhaps like a disused mall or an older business park, like industrial area, highway adjacent area, basically a large complex site, often though not always with a single owner. Could be a small number of owners who have sort of agreeing to undertake a complex project. And it's a way to have more flexibility in the design and outcomes for that large complex site. And while ensuring that the community, gets an outcome that is amenable to them. So typically these are places that have mixed use potential, housing, retail, perhaps hotels, cultural things like that. It involves taking that site, doing a lot of upfront planning and design along with the landowner, taking that to public input and review, and then, if that plan is approved, specifying that development could proceed in that very specific way. So again, it's complex, abnormal sites. You need flexibility. Typical zoning is just going to produce something that's suboptimal. Planning your developments, or PUDs, as some people say, are tools to get that the outcomes you want. I would say if you have a large and complex site, begin with a community visioning process. So you're not, suddenly a landowner comes to you and wants to do something and you're already on the back foot. You want to have a clear vision, whether in your master plan or in some sort of area planning document, for what this area wants to be. All right, inclusionary zoning. These are local laws that encourage the production of deed-restricted affordable units within a market rate development. So say you have either a subdivision or an apartment development, and you want to say, we would like part of this development to be held as deed-restricted affordable housing, workforce housing that could count towards a community's workforce housing requirement. Inclusionary zoning is a way to do that. Again, an innovative land use control. Under New Hampshire law, these have to be voluntary, really incentive-based laws. You'll see outside of New Hampshire, some communities have mandatory inclusionary housing that say any apartment building, 10% of those units need to be affordable. It's not how it plays in New Hampshire. You can make this option available to a landowner, but they cannot be required to avail themselves of it. Typically, those incentives might look like a density bonus, as we were just discussing, a reduction in lot sizes or parking requirements, that would be the sort of range of things you could offer as a way to encourage the use. And usually, so it obviously costs money to build homes. If they're held as affordable, it's very likely that there'll be a negative on a developer's balance sheet. So you have to, they have to sort of be able to offset that with some sort of bonus market rate component that allows them to sort of balance things out and be some measure better than what they would get under zoning otherwise. That's a whole world of financial calibration. So this really should have a financial analysis preceding any adoption of inclusionary zoning in order to maximize implementation by developers and to make sure also that you don't leave anything on the table. You get as many workforce housing units as you can get for what you're offering. Mike, it almost looked like you wanted to say something. Okay. Speaking of workforce housing, as you likely know, New Hampshire communities have a mandate to provide reasonable opportunities for the development of workforce housing. Basically, your zoning cannot require housing that, by the nature of the market, will be unaffordable to people of certain income brackets. So, yeah, you see the image on the screen here. Regulations cannot mandate unaffordable housing everywhere. Workforce housing must be allowed in a majority of residential areas. Now, a workforce housing ordinance is an ordinance that tries to encourage the market to meet that mandate in some way. Typically, it's a mix of cluster housing or inclusionary zoning provisions that can encourage landowners to build, homes with less footprint, less land consumption that could be likely less expensive. But that's how you see quote unquote workforce housing ordinances structured where they've been adopted. They could include any changes that would make workforce housing development easier. It doesn't necessarily mean it has an inclusionary component or a cluster component. Accessory dwelling units. So this is an additional secondary home on a single family lot, a smaller unit that's like subordinate to the main unit on the lot. They can either be attached or detached. Attached ADUs, might be carved out of, say, a basement, an attic, a portion of the second floor, something like that, or it could be an existing or new addition that's added to the primary home. A detached unit might be either a new build, unit that gets placed in, say, the backyard or something like that, or it could be a converted garage or other outbuilding, something like that. Now, attached ADUs must be allowed and are allowed by default in New Hampshire. So if your community has zoning and you don't make some provision for ADUs, then by default they're allowed in your residential districts. Now you can adopt an ADU ordinance that goes into your zoning that puts more specifications on that. There are some guardrails around that as well. You can also voluntarily adopt a detached ADU provision that allows them, they are not allowed by default under New Hampshire law. So there's a lot more into that. I would suggest New Hampshire Housing has a lot of good materials on that are linked in the toolbox. Manufactured housing. So this is housing that's built off-site, meeting specific HUD standards rather than state and local building standards, and it's built in the factory and then shipped on a chassis and placed on what can be a permanent or semi-permanent foundation. you're probably familiar with the term mobile homes. This is what some people think of as mobile homes. Mobile homes are typically those built before 1976 that don't meet the specific HUD standard. You don't really see them built anymore. Manufactured housing would be the sort of specific term that denotes the housing that gets built today. Because it's factory built, it's typically less expensive. Similar to ADUs, a community has to permit essentially the siting of manufactured housing, whether on standalone lots or in manufactured housing communities. That has to be allowed somewhere in your town, and so I believe is otherwise by default. I would have to double check that. So it's something you have to think about, and there can be, they can have requirements like you would with any other house, but it can't be typically more onerous than you would for a single family home. The communities of manufactured housing units, that's a whole different, it's a whole class of like manufactured housing development. And I'll just note that those can be resident owned. Typically we thought of this, those are something that are owned by a landlord offsite who rents out the lot to the owner of the manufactured home. But they can also be resident owned, and there's tools through the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund that can help residents undertake that process with technical assistance and financing tools. Speaking of financing tools, so this is we'll go into some of these. There's more on grants and loans that we didn't get into here, particularly around grants and loans that can be taken by developers or require that sort of developer input. These are ones that can be initiated at least by the community itself. So throw it to Matt for 7090.
Yeah, so basically what this is, it's state enabled, so RSA 79E, it's adopted by the municipality and administered by that municipality. Excuse me. And all it really is a nutshell. If you look at the diagram at the bottom, community revitalization tax relief, you see that increment in gray. It's really about the municipality delaying that increase in taxes, some or all, for a period of time based on a perceived community benefit, right? So it just delays an increase in taxes for a period of time. And it's built upon the idea that there's some public benefit, and you actually have to sign an agreement between the developer and the governing body, so board of selectmen or mayor or city council or town council, whoever your governing body is. They would sign an agreement with the developer saying, hey, yeah, you're going to do X number of workforce housing units. Here's this delay in your taxes increasing for a period of time. One thing to be aware of is the green on that diagram right there. It doesn't actually take money out of the tax revenue now. That can be a common misconception. It just delays that increase for a small period of time. So there's no tax revenue actually coming out of the town coffers for this. It's just delayed the increase. Let's see. So the steps involved, you've got to designate an area. It's typically a downtown or a village, and it's the properties within that area that are eligible, and that's mandated by RSA. I think the way to think about this is it's that public benefit piece that's the key, and it's site by site, property specific, that will identify what that benefit is. Could be workforce housing. It's also an economic development tool that a lot of communities use as well. And really it's applied in two ways. In one way, it's to get a project that may not be able to go through the renovation or rehabilitation over the top, like to kind of push it, like just that last little push to make it financially feasible. And another way to use it is to have a, say there's a type of development that the community would like to see. It's a way to provide an incentive to kind of get that type of development. workforce housing or another type of housing being the key, right? So you've got a mixed use downtown area. You're saying, hey, yeah, we want to get a few more, second and third floor apartments, whatever the case may be. That becomes the identified community benefit. And the Board of Selectmen are saying, hey, yeah, we're going to grant you 5 years or whatever, they end up coming up with. Because you're going to do that, we'll give you 100% of that increment in gray. We'll delay that for 5 years. Like that's literally the simplified example of that. And that's really it. Just think it delays the increase for a period of time based on a benefit that the selectmen kind of negotiate with the developer.
Great. So a new piece of 79E adopted in 2021 by the legislature, 79E 4-C, is something called housing opportunity zone. So this is very similar to that community revitalization tax relief incentive, the sort of what you might think of as like vanilla 79E. And it's similar but different. So instead of a village or downtown area, a community can designate just a housing opportunity zone wherever it sees fit. So this could be an area, that's been underutilized in some way, or like a former industrial area, sort of, again, the sort of disused mall, something like that, and says, okay, we're gonna create this tax incentive that works exactly like the rest of 79E. You have this increment, and the increment is untaxed for a period of time. As long as you provide 30% of your homes as deed-restricted workforce units, deed-restricted affordable housing, as long as you provide that specific community benefit, you become eligible for this housing opportunity zone tax relief. So functions very similarly, but has a specific community benefit attached and can happen outside of a traditional village area in a place where a town designates as a housing opportunity zone. Tax increment financing. So Mike, I'll pass this one to you.
I know we're getting close to the end, but very quickly, this is one of those tools that folks think that are, it's difficult to implement. There's some great examples around the state of tax increment financing. It does take a political process. You need to go to town meeting and adopt 162 or RSA 162K. You need to develop a plan, but essentially it's a tool to be proactive, to develop infrastructure within a specified area, and however that's financed, that financing is paid off by the increase in the tax benefit, the tax valuation of that district. Great examples of smaller communities. You clearly need a strong staff, but the tool is there are some great examples of how it's been used to be proactive and develop some infrastructure to spur some development. And you get into all kinds of other political conversations about working with the water precinct of your community and all those things, but it's a great opportunity to make those connections and do that coordination. A lot of planning needs to be done, but some great examples here in New Hampshire.
Totally. So to just try to close this out as quickly as possible here, two other tools that didn't kind of fit into the buckets we had crafted here. Wastewater system alternatives. This is sort of noted earlier that not every site is going to have sewer, and then septic becomes a barrier to sort of lower land intensity that could potentially be more affordable. Three kind of approaches in how to try to work around that, and these things kind of work together. So site design such that you can make use of large green spaces for some sort of shared septic system. Then that shared septic system that sort of concentrates the wastewater and then puts it into a leach field, and then pre-treatment, which having what's called an innovative alternative device to treat the wastewater before it gets put into a leach field, which would sort of increase the capacity of the leach field available. Now, all of that is covered by DES. This is the type of thing that you really need to be, the town and the developer need to be in active conversation with DES to make sure you're not getting ahead of your skis here. But it's an important set of considerations, and there's been some good examples in New Hampshire of how this sort of decentralized but clustered wastewater treatment can work. And then lastly, short-term rental regulations. These are things like Airbnb, Vrbo, that in some communities, but not all, are going to have a significant impact on the long-term year-round housing stock. Certain seacoast communities, certain mountain communities, places near colleges, etc. There are regulations that towns can use. This is sort of an actively developing body of law. But the simplest thing is sort of, treating short-term rentals as a sort of bed and breakfast use, and having them conform to local zoning in that way. There's a bunch of other options, things like registering the properties, having regular inspection fees, using meals and rooms tax, different max days rented, things like that communities have implemented. Sort of detail more of those in the toolbox, but there's some basic things you can do and then some more advanced things that you can do. But this is also one to consult town council on for sure. Okay, I understand it's 12:57. We've not left any time here for the Q&A. I'm not sure if Teams just kicks us out or what, but happy to discuss. If folks want to raise their hands or write stuff in the chat. Yes, there's a question in the chat. Will the slideshow be sent out after the webinar? Yes, and we will post it on the NH Housing Toolbox website as well. Composting toilets are an interesting avenue as well, yes. That would be an interesting avenue to look into, yes. So question in the chat about sprinklers and elevators, which are cost prohibited at a 2 to 3 story mixed use downtown scale. Yes, that is a good point. I would certainly need like a New Hampshire familiar architect would be able to speak to the elevator question as well. Typically, at a 2 to 3 story scale, elevators should not be required. Though I'm not an expert in the building code, so don't quote me on that. Sprinklers certainly could be, and that's a question. I think there's some innovations happening in terms of circulation patterns and materials that could reduce the need for sprinkler systems under certain building codes, but I'm not sure about the New Hampshire code specifically. a question in the chat from Molly. Have you seen New Hampshire communities incentivize manufactured housing creation? Can they do so outside the traditional park to create garden condos and the like? I'll let other folks potentially weigh in with community examples that they have. I've not seen a lot of, I'll say I haven't seen a lot of incentives, but certainly design guidelines or standards that would move it closer to the type of garden condo you describe. But I can't think of any incentive examples.
Yeah.
And just to note, Noah has posted a link in the chat to a workforce housing coalition of Greater Seacoast about water and sewer related housing solutions.
So June, maybe we should make our plug for the next 4 Thursdays.
Yes, indeed. So training 1 down. Great job, everyone. Next Thursday, we'll be talking open space and cluster housing. Again, that's with planner from Salem. Then there's a transfer of development rights on the following Thursday. That's June 15th. On June 22nd, we'll go into RSA 79E, and that'll be both the Community Revitalization Tax Relief Incentive and Housing Opportunity Zones. We'll cover both. And then form-based codes on the 29th. Registration is at nhhousingtoolbox.org/training. That'll be the links to all of those registration pages through Teams. All right. So thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Good job, all.
I hope to see you at future trainings.